I'm Margaret, 58 years old, and I thought I knew what betrayal felt like until I found my husband of 30 years in bed with my best friend. Richard built a real estate empire that made us millionaires, but he never bothered to read the paperwork I handled. When I confronted him about the affair, he looked me straight in the eyes and said, "You need to get used to it. Diane is better than you in every way." I didn't argue, just smiled and walked away. Before I tell you how my husband discovered the truth about his empire, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button if you believe karma eventually finds everyone who deserves it. I met Richard when I was 24, working as a paralegal at Simmons & Whitaker, a small law firm in downtown Boston. I'd grown up in a middle-class family in Rhode Island, the daughter of a high school teacher and a nurse. My parents had instilled in me the value of education and financial independence, which is why I'd put myself through college and paralegal training while working evenings at a local diner. Richard walked into our firm one afternoon looking for legal advice on a small property he wanted to purchase. He couldn't afford one of the senior attorneys, so they assigned him to me for preliminary paperwork. He was 30, ambitious, and struggling to make his mark as a real estate agent. What he lacked in resources he made up for with vision and charm. "One day, I'm going to transform the skyline of this city," he told me during that first meeting. I was impressed by his confidence, but practical enough to focus on the immediate legal needs. "For now, let's make sure you don't get sued over this property purchase." We started dating 3 weeks later. Richard was different from the law students and young professionals I usually met. He didn't come from money or connections, but he had an infectious energy and determination that made me believe in his dreams. My parents were concerned when, after only 8 months of dating, Richard proposed. "He seems very focused on success, Margaret," my father warned. "Make sure he's equally focused on making you happy." But I was in love with both the man and his vision. We married in a modest ceremony using most of our savings to put a down payment on our first apartment instead of an expensive wedding. What Richard didn't know when he married me was that I had saved nearly $18,000 from years of careful budgeting and living frugally. When he found a distressed property he believed had potential, I surprised him by offering my savings to help secure the financing. "I can't take your money, Mags," he protested, using the nickname only he ever called me. "It's not taking, it's investing," I corrected him. "We're partners now, remember?" That first property, a rundown 6-unit apartment building in an up-and-coming neighborhood, became the foundation of Harrington Developments. My legal background proved invaluable as we navigated zoning regulations, contractor agreements, and tenant leases. I spent evenings after my regular job helping Richard with paperwork, learning the real estate business from the ground up alongside him. When the renovated building sold for nearly twice our investment, 18 months later, Richard was ecstatic. "This is just the beginning, Mags. We're going to build an empire together." As his ambitions grew and projects became more complex, I found myself increasingly drawn into the business operations. By our 5th anniversary, Richard had convinced me to leave the law firm and work full-time on Harrington Developments. "No one looks out for our interests the way you do," he argued. "Plus, you understand all the legal stuff that makes my head spin." It was a natural division of labor. Richard was the visionary and deal maker, while I became the detail-oriented administrator who made sure everything was legally sound and properly executed. I drafted contracts, reviewed partnerships, and structured our growing number of LLCs and holding companies. "Just handle the paperwork, Mags," Richard would say. "I'll focus on making the deals." As the years passed, Harrington Developments expanded from residential renovations to commercial properties and eventually to luxury high-rise developments. Our modest apartment gave way to a larger condo, then to a house in the suburbs, and finally to a sprawling estate in Westchester County with 6 bedrooms, a pool, and manicured gardens. We socialized with politicians, celebrities, and business elites. Richard's name appeared in business magazines and local society pages. He embraced the role of successful developer with natural ease, always dressed impeccably in tailored suits, driving luxury cars, and maintaining the right memberships at exclusive clubs. I noticed the changes in our relationship gradually. The young man who had once brought me coffee in bed and asked my opinion on everything now interrupted me at dinner parties and made decisions without consultation. Success hadn't exactly changed Richard. It had amplified aspects of his personality that had always been present but contained. "You worry too much about details," Meg's became his common refrain whenever I raised concerns about a contract or partnership structure. "That's why I have you to handle all that boring stuff." Despite his dismissive attitude, I continued to structure our business affairs carefully. My years in legal work had taught me the importance of protecting assets and clarifying ownership. While Richard focused on appearances and expansion, I quietly ensured that our growing empire rested on a solid legal foundation, with me at the center of the ownership structure. Our inability to have children became another source of subtle tension. After years of trying and 3 miscarriages medical tests revealed, I had a condition that made carrying a pregnancy to term nearly impossible. Richard never openly blamed me, but his occasional comments cut deep. "The Williams just had their 3rd kid," he'd remark after running into business associates. "Some women are just naturally maternal, I guess." Without children to focus on, I poured even more energy into the business. I became known among our employees as the one who actually made things happen while Richard made the deals. I stayed out of the spotlight, comfortable in my behind-the-scenes role, making sure our growing empire was protected legally and financially. As Richard's success grew, so did his ego and emotional distance. The man who had once consulted me on every decision now seemed irritated by my input. The partner who had valued my legal expertise now treated my concerns as unnecessary complications. "Just draw up the papers the way they want, Mags," he'd say impatiently when I pointed out risks in a deal. "You're overcomplicating things as usual." What Richard never realized was that my overcomplicating included structuring our holdings in ways that protected us, particularly me. Each time we created a new LLC or acquired a property, I ensured the ownership documents reflected my contributions to the business. I wasn't being deceptive. All the paperwork was there for Richard to review. He simply never bothered to read the boring legal stuff that didn't interest him. Even our primary residence, the Westchester estate that Richard loved showcasing to business associates, was titled solely in my name, a decision I'd made after one of our tax attorneys mentioned it would provide better asset protection. Richard had signed the papers without a second glance, too busy planning the housewarming party to review the property deed. By our 25th anniversary, Harrington Developments had grown into a regional powerhouse with projects across the Northeast. We were wealthy beyond anything we'd imagined during those early days in our first apartment. But the partnership that had built this success was fracturing beneath the surface, weakened by Richard's growing arrogance and my quiet resentment. I still loved him, or at least the memory of who he had been. I still believed in the vision we had built together. But increasingly, I felt like an employee rather than a wife and partner, a useful asset rather than a loved companion. I had no idea then how valuable my careful legal structuring would prove to be, or how soon I would need the protections I had built into our business empire. 5 years ago, I met Diane Lawson at a charity gala benefiting local arts education. Richard had been scheduled to attend with me, but canceled at the last minute due to a property emergency that couldn't wait. I'd grown accustomed to attending such events alone, maintaining our social connections while Richard handled business. Diane approached me at the bar after I'd been standing alone for nearly an hour. "Your shoes are absolutely killing me," she said with a warm smile. "My feet hurt just looking at those heels." I laughed, appreciating her directness. Beauty is pain, or so they say. Whoever they are, they've clearly never worn 5-inch Louboutins to a 4-hour event, she replied, gesturing for the bartender. "I'm Diane, by the way." There was something immediately likable about Diane. Where I was reserved and analytical, she was vivacious and spontaneous. She made easy conversation, drawing me out with genuine questions about my interests, rather than Richard's business, which made a refreshing change from most social interactions I experienced. I learned she was recently divorced from a banking executive who had left her for his 23-year-old assistant. The divorce had been financially devastating. Her ex-husband's clever accounting had hidden assets and left her struggling to restart her interior design career after years of focusing on their home and social life. 15 years of marriage and all I got was half the furniture and a mountain of trust issues, she said with a forced lightness that didn't quite hide her pain. I felt an immediate kinship with her, another woman who had invested in a relationship only to find herself undervalued. Before the night ended, we'd exchanged numbers and planned to meet for lunch the following week. Our friendship developed quickly. We had regular Tuesday lunches where we discussed everything from books to business. I found myself looking forward to these meetings, realizing how few true friendships I had maintained while focusing on Richard's career and our social obligations. When Diane mentioned struggling to find clients for her interior design business, I immediately thought of Richard's developments. "We're always looking for designers for our model units," I told her. "Would you be interested in presenting your portfolio to our team?" Diane's gratitude was overwhelming. "Margaret, you have no idea what this opportunity means to me." I arranged a meeting with our development team, and Diane's talent spoke for itself. Her designs were both elegant and practical luxury with livability. She began working on several Harrington development projects, gradually rebuilding her client base and reputation. As our friendship deepened, Diane became a regular presence at our home. Richard initially seemed indifferent to her, barely engaging beyond basic pleasantries. But he appreciated the design work she did for our projects, especially when buyers commented on the sophisticated interiors of our model units. "Your friend has good taste," he remarked after one particularly successful open house. "We should use her for the new downtown development too." For nearly 3 years, Diane became my closest confidant. As Richard grew more distant and critical, I increasingly relied on her for emotional support. "He barely notices when I'm in the room anymore," I confided during one of our lunches. "Sometimes I wonder if he'd even care if I disappeared entirely." Diane reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "He's a fool if he doesn't see what he has in you, Margaret. You're the backbone of that entire operation." Her validation meant everything during a time when Richard's compliments had been replaced with critiques. "You've put on weight, Mags. That outfit makes you look older. Why can't you be more sociable at these events?" Diane encouraged me to reconnect with Richard romantically. "Men sometimes need a jolt to appreciate what they have," she suggested. "Surprise him. Remind him you're not just his business manager." I took her advice, planning special dinners, buying new lingerie, even arranging weekend getaways. Richard seemed briefly engaged before reverting to his distracted, critical self. "I have a development to finish, Mags," he said during a weekend I'd planned in the Berkshires. "I can't just turn off my phone and pretend we're newlyweds again." The first sign something was wrong came when Diane began canceling our Tuesday lunches. "Client emergency," her text would read, or "deadline for the showcase room." Reasonable excuses that I accepted without question. Then I noticed her name appearing more frequently on Richard's calendar. Design consultations, scheduled after normal business hours. Site visits on weekends. I told myself it made sense she was working on multiple projects for us now. Richard's behavior changed too. He started coming home even later, sometimes not until after midnight. His weekend emergencies increased. He became protective of his phone, taking it into the bathroom when he showered, keeping it face down on tables. I might have continued ignoring these signs had I not accidentally seen a text notification on his phone one morning when he was in the shower. Richard had left it on the kitchen counter, and when it lit up, I glimpsed Diane's name and the words, "Last night was amazing." My hand shook as I picked up the phone. I told myself there could be an innocent explanation. Perhaps she was referring to a successful client event. But my heart knew better. I didn't confront him immediately. The paralegal in me wanted evidence, not just suspicion. I hired Jack Morrison, a private investigator recommended by a former colleague, and asked him to track Richard's movements for 2 weeks. I need to know if my husband is being faithful. I told Jack the words painful to speak aloud. 10 days later, Jack delivered a manila envelope to me during a private meeting at a coffee shop far from our usual haunts. Inside were dozens of photos Richard and Diane entering our beach house in the Hamptons, embracing on the deck, drawing the bedroom curtains. Date and timestamp showed they had spent entire weekends there, while I believe Richard was handling business emergencies and Diane was at design showcases. The most painful photo showed them dining at Marcello's, the Italian restaurant where Richard had proposed to me 30 years earlier. I sat in my car for nearly an hour after Jack left the envelope on my passenger seat like a ticking bomb. 30 years of marriage, 5 years of friendship, all reduced to secret rendezvous and calculated lies. But beneath my heartbreak, something else stirred a cold, clear determination. If Richard and Diane thought they could discard me after I had built this life, this business, this success alongside him, they would soon discover how wrong they were. I drove not home, but to the office of Samuel Abernathy, my former mentor from Simmons & Whitaker, and now a senior partner at one of Boston's top law firms. I hadn't consulted him professionally in years, but this situation required his expertise and discretion. Margaret. Sam greeted me warmly before noting my expression. What's wrong? I placed the envelope on his desk. I need to understand exactly where I stand legally. For 2 weeks after discovering the affair, I maintained a facade of normalcy while methodically gathering information and consulting with Sam about my options. I reviewed every business document, ownership structure, and financial account associated with Harrington Developments. What I confirmed during this process both reassured and empowered me. Over 30 years of handling the boring paperwork, I had created a legal structure that now served as my armor. Richard was listed as the face of Harrington Developments, but I was the majority owner of the primary holding company that controlled our most valuable assets. Many properties, including our main residence, were solely in my name for tax and liability purposes. Richard had signed everything willingly over the years, too busy or too uninterested to read the details of what I put before him. His trust in me to handle the boring stuff, while he made the glamorous deals, had created a situation he was entirely unaware of. With this knowledge secured, I finally decided to confront him. I prepared a special dinner at home, his favorite beef Wellington, an expensive bottle of wine candlelight. Not because he deserved this consideration, but because I wanted to catch him off guard. Richard arrived home at 8:30, 2 hours after I'd asked him to be there. I had kept everything warm, maintained my composure, and refilled my wine glass several times. "Sorry I'm late, Mags," he said, not sounding particularly sorry as he loosened his tie. "The Jefferson project negotiations ran long." I smiled, knowing from Jack's surveillance that he'd actually been at Diane's downtown apartment until 8. "No problem. I've kept everything warm." He seemed surprised by the elegant table setting and my calm demeanor. Perhaps he'd expected complaints about his lateness or questions about his day. We made small talk through the first course, me asking about the Jefferson project, him fabricating details, unaware that I knew exactly where he'd been. I waited until he was midway through the main course before changing the subject. "Richard, I've been thinking about us lately." I began, my voice steady despite my pounding heart. "We seem to have grown apart." He looked up from his plate, wariness crossing his features. "We've both been busy. That's normal after 30 years. "Yes, busy," I agreed. "You particularly. All those late meetings and weekend emergencies must be exhausting." His fork paused halfway to his mouth. "That's the nature of the business. You know that." I took a sip of wine, gathering my courage. "And how is Diane? I haven't seen her in weeks. She keeps canceling our lunch dates." The slight stiffening of his shoulders told me everything. "How would I know she's your friend?" "That's interesting," I said, reaching for the envelope I'd placed on the sideboard, "because according to these photos, she's been much more than my friend lately." I laid the images on the table one by one. Richard and Diane entering our beach house, embracing on the deck, the dinner at Marcello's. Richard's face cycled through the shock, anger, and finally a cold calculation I had never seen directed at me before. He didn't deny, it didn't apologize, didn't show any remorse whatsoever. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice flat. "Long enough to understand this isn't a momentary lapse of judgment," I replied. "This is a deliberate betrayal by both my husband and my closest friend." Richard pushed his plate away and leaned back in his chair, studying me as if seeing me for the first time. "What do you want, Margaret? Money? The house? What will it take for this to go away quietly?" His cavalier attitude made my blood boil, but I kept my expression neutral. "I want to understand why. 30 years, Richard. Was that worth nothing?" He sighed, impatient with my emotional question. "People change, Mags. We're not the same people who bought that first apartment building. I've outgrown this marriage." "You've outgrown me, you mean," I corrected. "If you want me to be brutally honest, yes." He said, his words cutting through me like glass. "Diane understands the world I live in now. She enhances my image, makes connections I need. She's vibrant, sociable, everything a man in my position needs." I stared at him, this stranger wearing my husband's face. "And what about loyalty, partnership, the life we built together?" Richard's laugh was short and dismissive. "Let's not pretend you built all this. You handled paperwork, Mags. I made the deals that created our wealth. I am Harrington Developments." The sheer arrogance, the erasure of my contributions stunned me momentarily. Before I could respond, he continued, his voice hardening. "Look, you need to get used to it. Diane is better than you in every way. She's younger, more beautiful, more sophisticated. She belongs in my world now. You're just what?" I prompted when he hesitated. "Outdated," he finished callously, "like using a flip phone in a smartphone world." I felt the blow of his words physically, a pain in my chest so acute I almost gasped. But decades of maintaining composure in tough negotiations served me well. "I see," I said quietly. "And what happens now?" Richard, apparently relieved I wasn't creating a scene, outlined his vision of our future with business-like efficiency. "I'll be filing for divorce, of course. I'm prepared to be generous, one of our smaller properties, perhaps the condo in Back Bay, and a reasonable allowance. You can keep your car and your jewelry." "How considerate," I murmured. "Diane will be moving into this house," he continued, as if discussing a simple business transition. "I'd appreciate if you could clear out your things within the next 2 weeks. My attorneys will be in touch about the settlement details." I studied him, this man I had loved and supported for 30 years now, casually discarding me like an outdated appliance. "Is there anything else I should know?" He checked his watch, clearly eager to end this conversation. "I think that covers everything for now. My lawyer will contact yours to handle the paperwork." I nodded, rising from the table. "I see. Then I'll say good night. I'll sleep in the guest room." Richard looked surprised at my calm acceptance. "That's good. I appreciate you being reasonable about this, Mags." As I left the dining room, I paused in the doorway. "One last thing, Richard. How long has this been going on?" He hesitated before answering. "About a year." A year. 365 days of lies. 52 weeks of betrayal. While I was planning our 30th anniversary celebration, my husband and best friend had been planning a future without me. I didn't respond, simply walked upstairs to the guest room and closed the door. Only then, in the privacy of that impersonal space, did I allow myself to cry for what I had lost and what I now had to do. I slept little that night, mentally preparing for the battle ahead. Despite my legal advantage, I knew Richard wouldn't surrender easily once he discovered the truth about our business holdings. His ego wouldn't allow it. The next morning, I left the house before Richard awoke and went directly to Sam's office. We spent the day reviewing all ownership documentation, account access, and potential challenges Richard might raise. Sam's team prepared contingency plans for various scenarios, including the possibility that Richard might attempt to liquidate assets or transfer funds. "He doesn't have the authority to sell major assets without your signature," Sam assured me, but he could still create problems with the day-to-day operating accounts. By that afternoon, we had implemented new security protocols on all financial accounts. Any transaction over $10,000 would require dual authorization. I also instructed our IT department to secure all company data and limit Richard's access to sensitive financial information, citing security upgrades as the reason. While I was taking these precautions, Richard was apparently meeting with his own attorneys. Our company's CFO, Robert Lindstrom, called to inform me that Richard had requested detailed financial reports on all our holdings. He seemed unusually interested in ownership structures, Robert noted. I told him most of that information would need to come from you since you handle the legal documentation. Thank you, Robert, I replied. If he asks again, please direct those requests to me. Over the next several days, Richard and I engaged in an elaborate dance of avoidance at home, while I monitored his activities through loyal employees. He made no further mention of our confrontation or his divorce plan, seemingly confident that I had accepted my fate. I learned from our head of security that Richard had removed several boxes of documents from the office. From our executive assistant, I discovered he had scheduled meetings with 3 different law firms known for aggressive divorce representation. And from Jack Morrison, who I kept on retainer, I received confirmation that Richard had met with a financial advisor specializing in offshore accounts. 7 days after our confrontation, Richard finally made his move. He left a message with my assistant that he needed to discuss the transition and suggested a formal meeting with our respective legal teams the following Monday. Mr. Harrington says to tell you he's prepared to be generous if this goes smoothly. My assistant reported clearly uncomfortable delivering the message. I smiled reassuringly at her. Please tell Mr. Harrington. I look forward to the meeting and appreciate his consideration. I spent the weekend with Sam and his team preparing for every possible scenario. We assembled comprehensive documentation of all business structures, ownership certificates, and financial statements. We also gathered evidence of Richard's recent attempts to access accounts and remove documents. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Sam asked as we wrapped up our preparations on Sunday evening. He'll offer you millions to walk away quietly. You could start fresh, avoid the mess. I considered the question seriously. Part of me did want to simply take a settlement and disappear from Richard's life. But a stronger part, the part that had helped build an empire from a single apartment building, refused to be discarded so easily. He doesn't get to erase me, I said finally. Not after 30 years, not after everything I've contributed. Monday morning arrived with a strange sense of calm. I dressed carefully in a tailored navy suit, professional understated but impeccably fitted. My armor for the battle ahead. I had suggested we meet at Sam's office rather than Harrington Development's headquarters, citing the need for privacy. Richard had agreed, probably assuming I wanted to avoid office gossip about our divorce. When I arrived, Sam greeted me in the reception area. He's here already, he murmured, and he brought Diane. The petty power play didn't surprise me. Richard would want to demonstrate his commitment to his new relationship to show that our marriage was irretrievably over. Good, I replied. I want her to see this too. The conference room fell silent as I entered. Richard sat at the head of the table, a position he hadn't been invited to take with Diane beside him. Her eyes widened when she saw me, then quickly looked away. 3 attorneys I didn't recognize sat across from Sam's team. Margaret? Richard nodded curtly. I believe you know Diane. Of course, I replied coolly. We were friends for 5 years before she began sleeping with my husband. Diane flinched but said nothing. Richard's attorney, a silver-haired man with an aggressive demeanor, quickly intervened. Mrs. Harrington, we're here to discuss an equitable dissolution of your marriage. Recriminations aren't productive. You're absolutely right, I agreed, taking a seat beside Sam. Let's focus on the business at hand. Richard's attorney opened a leather portfolio. My client is prepared to be quite generous. We're offering the Back Bay condominium valued at $2.6 million as an annual stipend of $250,000 for 10 years, and your vehicle and personal effects. Sam and I exchanged glances. Before we respond to your offer, Sam said. We should clarify the actual asset situation. Margaret has prepared a comprehensive overview. At Sam's nod, I distributed folders to everyone at the table. This documentation outlines the ownership structure of all assets currently held by or associated with Harrington Developments and the Harrington family personally. Richard barely glanced at his folder, his expression confident, as his attorney began reviewing the documents. But I watched with satisfaction as the lawyer's expression shifted from routine interest to confusion to alarm. Mr. Harrington, he said quietly, I need to speak with you privately for a moment. Whatever you have to say, you can say here, Richard replied impatiently. The attorney hesitated before continuing. According to these documents, Mrs. Harrington is the majority owner of Harrington Holdings, LLC, which controls 67% of Harrington Developments. Richard's expression froze. That's impossible. I founded the company. Check again. I've verified every document, Sam interjected smoothly. The ownership structure is exactly as presented. While you were the public face of the company, Mr. Harrington Margaret has been the majority owner since 2005 when you reorganized for tax purposes. Richard snatched the folder from his attorney and began rifling through the pages. This is some kind of trick. I never agreed to this. Actually, you did, I said calmly. You signed every document in that folder. You just never bothered to read what you were signing. As Richard frantically reviewed the documentation, Sam continued the presentation. Additionally, the primary residence in Westchester is titled solely in Margaret's name, as are the vacation properties in the Hamptons and Aspen. That's ridiculous, Diane interjected, speaking for the first time. Richard paid for those homes. With funds from Harrington Developments, I corrected her, which, as we've established, is primarily owned by me. Richard's face had turned an alarming shade of red. You tricked me, he accused. You buried this in legal jargon knowing I wouldn't read every page. No, Richard, I replied evenly. I structured our business affairs appropriately, and you signed off on them. Every document in that folder has your signature freely given. You trusted me to handle the boring paperwork. Remember? That's exactly what I did. Richard turned to his attorneys. This can't be legal. She manipulated me. His lead attorney looked uncomfortable. If you signed the documents, Mr. Harrington. Of course I signed them, Richard exploded. She's my wife. She handled the administrative side while I built the business. Which brings us to our counterproposal, Sam smoothly interjected. Given the actual ownership structure, Margaret is prepared to offer you the following settlement. I watched Richard's face as Sam outlined terms that were essentially the mirror image of what Richard had offered me: a smaller property, a reasonable allowance, and continued employment with Harrington Developments in a reduced capacity. This is insane, Richard sputtered. I am Harrington Developments. No, Richard, I corrected him gently. You're the face of Harrington Developments. I'm the owner. Diane, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly stood. Richard, what's happening? You told me you were worth at least $80 million. He is, I answered for him, but most of that $80 million belongs to me. Richard ignored Diane, focusing his fury on me. I'll fight this. I'll sue you for fraud. Sam calmly slid another document across the table. Before you make threats, you should be aware that we've documented your recent activities. Removing confidential company files, attempting to transfer funds to offshore accounts, meetings with financial advisors about hiding assets. Richard's attorney grabbed the document before Richard could, reviewing it with growing concern. Mr. Harrington, if these allegations are accurate, they're all documented, Sam assured him, with dates, times, and witnesses. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. Richard's confident bluster had given way to stunned disbelief. Diane looked increasingly uncomfortable, her eyes darting between Richard and the door. I need to consult with my client privately, Richard's attorney announced, closing his folder. Of course, Sam agreed. We'll give you the room. As we stood to leave, Richard grabbed my arm. Why are you doing this? You could have just taken the settlement and disappeared. I looked into the eyes of the man I had once loved with all my heart, now a stranger consumed by greed and entitlement. Because you don't get to erase me, Richard. I helped build everything you're so proud of. I supported you, advised you, protected our interests while you took all the credit. I made the deals, he insisted. I brought in the money. And I made sure we kept it, I replied. All those boring details you couldn't be bothered with. They're what secures wealth, Richard. They're what protects an empire. I removed his hand from my arm and turned to leave, but not before adding a final thought. By the way, you might want to ask Diane if she's still interested in you, now that she knows who actually owns the houses, the cars, and the bank accounts. As I walked out, I heard Diane's voice behind me already demanding explanations from Richard. Their relationship built on betrayal and material attraction was facing its first real test. I felt no vindictive pleasure, only a weary satisfaction that justice would be served not through vengeance, but through the careful, meticulous work I had done for decades while Richard took the spotlight. The next few weeks unfolded in a blur of legal meetings, business restructuring, and personal recalibration. Richard's initial threats of lawsuits dissolved when his new attorneys, his first team, resigned from the case, explained the potential consequences of challenging the documented ownership structure, especially given his recent attempts to hide assets. Diane disappeared from the picture almost immediately. According to office gossip, she had left Richard's temporary apartment after learning the true financial situation, taking with her several expensive watches and the credit cards he had given her. Richard eventually accepted a modified version of the settlement. I offered the Back Bay condo he had originally offered me a reasonable monthly stipend and a position with Harrington Developments as a consultant rather than CEO. The irony of him receiving essentially what he had planned to generously offer me was not lost on either of us. The transition of leadership at Harrington Developments created inevitable ripples in the business community. Many were shocked to learn that I had been the majority owner all along. Some business associates initially questioned my ability to lead the company, apparently assuming I had been merely an administrator rather than a strategic partner in its growth. My first board meeting as the acknowledged head of the company was a test of both my leadership and my emotional fortitude. Several board members who had been Richard's golf buddies were visibly uncomfortable with the new arrangement. Gentlemen, I began acknowledging the tension directly. I understand this transition may seem abrupt from your perspective, but I assure you the only thing that has changed is who sits at the head of this table. I have been involved in every significant decision this company has made for 30 years. Thomas Wheaton, our longest-serving board member, cleared his throat. With all due respect, Margaret, Richard was the deal-maker, the face clients trusted. Yes, he was excellent at that role, I agreed, and he will continue to bring in business as a consultant. But Harrington Developments has always been more than one person. It's the entire team in this room and beyond. I proceeded to outline my vision for the company's future, emphasizing continuity in our core luxury development business while proposing strategic diversification into mixed-use projects that would enhance communities while maintaining profitability. Richard taught me that vision creates opportunity, I told them. What I learned on my own is that sustainable success requires more than vision. It requires attention to detail, ethical practices, and community engagement. By the end of that 3-hour meeting, I had earned, if not their complete confidence, at least their willingness to see what I could do. The quarterly results that followed, showing our strongest performance in 2 years, helped solidify my position. Richard struggled to adjust to his new role. He alternated between resentment attempts at reconciliation and resignation. During one particularly difficult project meeting, he exploded with frustration. "This is my company," he shouted after I rejected one of his proposals. "I built this from nothing." The room fell silent as everyone waited for my response. I met his gaze calmly. "We built it together, Richard. The difference is, I always knew that. You never did." He stormed out, but returned the next day subdued and more cooperative. Gradually, he began to accept the new reality, especially as clients continued to work with the company under my leadership. As Richard adapted to his diminished role, I embraced my expanded one. I had always worked behind the scenes handling the boring details that Richard disdained. Now I applied that same meticulous attention to the entire operation, reviewing every aspect of our business with fresh eyes. What I discovered surprised even me. Despite my careful management, Richard's pursuit of prestige projects had created inefficiencies and missed opportunities. We had focused exclusively on luxury developments while ignoring the growing market for high-quality mixed-income housing. We had pursued flashy downtown projects while overlooking stable returns in emerging neighborhoods. I began steering the company in new directions, maintaining our luxury brand while diversifying into projects with stronger community benefits. We launched an affordable housing division alongside our high-end developments, creating mixed-use spaces that serve various income levels while remaining profitable. Luxury doesn't have to be exclusive, I explained to skeptical board members. Some of the most successful urban developments worldwide blend income levels and uses creating vibrant communities rather than isolated enclaves. This approach not only opened new markets, but also improved our relationship with city planning departments who had grown increasingly resistant to developments that catered only to the wealthy. Projects that might have faced years of approval battles now moved forward with community support. 6 months after taking control, I received an unexpected call from Diane. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered, lacking the confident charm that had once characterized her. "Margaret," she began hesitantly, "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from." "That's accurate," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "What can I do for you, Diane?" "I wanted to apologize," she said. "What I did was unforgivable, betraying our friendship, lying to you for months. While sleeping with my husband," I added, not making this easy for her. She sighed. "Yes, I have no excuse that would make any difference. I wanted you to know that I regret it deeply." I considered hanging up. This woman had been my closest friend and had betrayed me in the most painful way possible. Yet something in her voice, a genuine remorse perhaps, kept me on the line. "Why now?" I asked. "It's been 6 months. "I've been in therapy," she admitted, "working through why I would hurt someone who only ever showed me kindness. I don't expect forgiveness, Margaret. I just needed you to know that I understand the harm I caused, and I'm truly sorry." I was silent for a long moment, processing my complex emotions. "Thank you for the apology," I finally said. "I can't say it changes anything, but I appreciate you making it." "I understand," she replied. "That's all I wanted to say." After hanging up, I sat at my desk, unexpectedly moved by the conversation. Not because I was ready to forgive either Diane or Richard, but because I realized how far I had come in my healing journey. 6 months earlier, such a call would have devastated me anew. Now it felt like closing a chapter in a story I had moved beyond. The betrayal had forced me to confront difficult truths about my marriage, my self-worth, and my future. In therapy sessions of my own, I had begun to recognize how I had allowed Richard's dismissive attitude to diminish my sense of value over the years. I had accepted his narrative that he was the true creator of our success, while I merely handled details. "You need to recognize your own worth independent of Richard's validation," my therapist had advised. "Your business acumen and legal knowledge built protections he never appreciated until he lost them." This perspective shift helped me move forward, not just professionally, but personally. I began reconnecting with friends I had neglected during my years of focusing on Richard's career. I discovered that many had seen the changes in Richard long before I had been willing to acknowledge them. "He became so condescending toward you," my college friend Julia observed during our first lunch in nearly 2 years. "We all noticed it, but you seemed to accept it as normal." "I thought that was the price of success," I admitted, "that ambitious men inevitably outgrow the women who supported them in the beginning." "That's what patriarchy wants us to believe," Julia replied with characteristic directness, "that we should expect less as we age while men expect more." These renewed friendships based on authentic connection rather than social advantage became an important part of my healing process. I also formed new relationships with women in business leadership positions, creating an informal network of support and mentorship. Gradually, the pain of betrayal receded, replaced by a growing confidence in my own capabilities and worth. I had not just survived Richard's betrayal, I had emerged stronger, more authentic, and more purposeful than before. 1 year after the confrontation in Sam's conference room, I made a decision that surprised even my closest advisors. I offered to buy out Richard's remaining minority stake in Harrington Developments for a fair market value that would give him financial independence. "Are you sure?" Sam asked when I proposed the idea. "You don't owe him anything more than the settlement." "This isn't about owing him," I explained. "It's about freeing myself completely from the past. As long as he has ownership, however minor, he has a reason to remain connected to me and the company." The buyout offer was generous, but not excessive enough for Richard to live comfortably and perhaps start a small venture of his own, but not enough to fund the lavish lifestyle he had become accustomed to as the face of Harrington Developments. Richard accepted after minimal negotiation. When we met to sign the final papers, he seemed different, subdued, perhaps even humbled by the events of the past year. "I underestimated you, Mags," he said as we concluded the transaction. "For 30 years, I underestimated you." "Yes," I agreed simply. "You did. For what it's worth, I'm sorry," he added, "not just for Diane, but for taking you for granted all those years." I studied his face, looking for the manipulative charm I had come to distrust, but saw only resignation and what appeared to be genuine regret. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "I hope you find whatever you're looking for, Richard." As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. "You know, you really are extraordinary. I just couldn't see it." After he left, I sat alone in my office reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The betrayal that had seemed like the end of my world had instead become the beginning of a new chapter, one where I defined my worth on my own terms. I had lost a husband and a friend, but I had found myself in the process. Looking back now, 2 years after discovering my husband and best friend's betrayal, I can honestly say that the pain was worth the growth it triggered. The devastation of that moment when Richard coldly told me that Diane was better in every way became the catalyst for a profound personal transformation. The company has thrived under my leadership, expanding in directions Richard never considered. Our mixed-use developments have won industry awards for innovation and community impact. Our affordable housing division now accounts for 20% of our business, providing both stable returns and significant social benefits. More importantly, I've discovered a confidence and sense of purpose I never knew I possessed. For decades, I defined myself primarily as Richard's wife and business partner, measuring my worth through his recognition and approval. Now I understand my own value independent of anyone else's validation. This journey hasn't been without challenges. There were nights I cried myself to sleep mourning not just my marriage, but the decades I spent diminishing myself to bolster Richard's ego. There were moments I questioned every decision, wondering if I could really lead a company Richard had always claimed as his creation. But with each success, each challenge overcome, my confidence grew. I discovered that the same attention to detail and strategic thinking that had protected our assets could also drive innovation and growth when given free rein. I've remained single since the divorce, though not for lack of interest from others. Several business associates have made their interest known, but I've chosen to focus on rediscovering myself before considering another relationship. When and if I choose to date again, it will be from a position of wholeness rather than need. At 58, I'm more comfortable in my own skin than I've ever been. I've taken up activities I always wanted to try, but set aside to accommodate Richard's preferences, hiking, photography, even salsa dancing lessons. I've reconnected with family members I had neglected during years of prioritizing Richard's social and business connections. My relationship with Richard remains strictly professional. He occasionally consults on specific projects where his expertise adds value, but we maintain clear boundaries. I bear him no ill will anymore, having realized that staying angry would only continue giving him power over my emotions. As for Diane, I heard she relocated to Chicago last year and has rebuilt her interior design business. We have had no further contact since her apology call, which is for the best. Some betrayals change relationships irreparably, and attempting to rebuild would only reopen wounds better left to heal. The most meaningful outcome of this difficult journey has been my ability to help other women protect themselves legally and financially. I've established a mentoring program for women in business and law, sharing the lessons I learned through my experience. Always read every document, I tell them. Know exactly what you own and what you're entitled to. Never assume someone else will protect your interests better than you can protect them yourself. These sessions often evolve into deeper discussions about self-worth, recognizing manipulation, and setting healthy boundaries in both business and personal relationships. The wisdom I share comes at a high personal cost, but helping others avoid similar pain gives meaning to my experience. I've learned that betrayal often reveals truths we've been avoiding. Richard's affair with Diane didn't create the problems in our marriage. It merely exposed the inequality and lack of respect that had been growing for years. His betrayal forced me to confront how much of myself I had surrendered in the name of supporting his dreams. The most valuable lesson from this journey is understanding that losing what you thought you wanted can sometimes lead to finding what you truly need. I thought I needed Richard's approval and our marriage to be fulfilled. What I actually needed was to recognize my own worth and capabilities. Today, as I lead board meetings, approve new developments, and mentor young professionals, I no longer think of myself as the woman behind a successful man. I am simply a successful woman in my own right, with the scars and wisdom that come from surviving betrayal and emerging stronger. If you're facing betrayal or underestimation in your own life, remember that what seems like an ending may actually be a beginning. The paperwork and details others dismiss as boring might be the very things that protect you when you need it most. And the strength to rebuild after betrayal already exists within you, waiting to be discovered. Have you ever had to rebuild your life after betrayal, or discovered your own strength in unexpected ways? Share your story in the comments below. If this journey resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to hear more stories of women finding their power in difficult circumstances. And if you know someone who needs this message, share it with them. Sometimes the stories of others' resilience are exactly what we need to find our own. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, your worth is never determined by someone else's ability to see it.